Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. If you break your arm, the medical x-ray gives you a purely binary answer.
Right. The doctor just points to a jagged white line on a glowing screen and says, there's your problem.
Exactly. It's visible, it's categorized, and honestly, that certainty is pretty comforting. But today, we're stepping into a diagnostic landscape where that x-ray machine is just, well, it's fundamentally broken.
Yeah, it really is. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Right. We are looking at a space that is incredibly murky, highly emotional, and completely non-binary.
I mean, when you start talking about neurodevelopment and, childhood trauma, addiction, municipal zoning, there is no single jagged white line to point to.
No, there isn't. And that complex landscape is exactly what we're wading into for you today.
Yeah.
Because if there is any social crisis in America right now that defies a simple, clean diagnosis, it is homelessness.
It's the crisis of our time, really.
It is. So we are taking a deep dive into a comprehensive and occasionally pretty provocative book. It's titled Meeting Homelessness with Hope, One Community's Response.
Written by Jack Briggs, Mike Hamel, Joel Siebersma, and Larry Yonker.
Right. And the mission for this deep dive is to unpack how one specific city, Colorado Springs, and specifically a place called the Springs Rescue Mission, or SRM, managed to dramatically reduce its unsheltered homeless population.
Which is, that reduction is a massive anomaly. Nationally, the trends are pointing in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah, they really are.
We are seeing the numbers of unsheltered individuals just surging in so many major metropolitan areas right now.
Which makes this so fascinating.
Exactly. When a community actually bucks that trend in a statistically significant way, it demands a rigorous look at the mechanics of their ecosystem.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we aren't just going to recite municipal zoning policies and budget spreadsheets.
But anybody wants to listen to just that.
Right. Definitely not. We are going to synthesize the history of this mission, the fierce national political debates over how we fund these programs, and the specific physical methodology of the shelter itself.
And most importantly, the deeply personal stories that anchor the book's narrative.
Yes, the human element. For you listening right now, consider this a challenge to look past the surface-level talking points you hear on the evening news. We are going to get into the psychology of compassion.
It's a deep psychology, too.
It is. And I hope this challenges you to evaluate your own assumptions about why homelessness happens and how a community can actually intervene.
Because to really understand that intervention, you cannot start with a policy white paper. You just can't.
Where do you have to start?
You have to start with the human brain under extreme duress. The authors actually anchor their entire argument around a composite character named Mad Dog.
Mad Dog, right.
Yeah. He represents the chronic, unsheltered homeless population that they serve at SRM. And his narrative runs as a thread throughout the whole text.
It really illustrates the human cost of these abstract policies, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I want to look at the origins of Mad Dog's trauma because it reveals just how early the institutional failures begin. The book notes his mother struggled with addiction to cheap drugs.
Right, and she moved through a series of really abusive boyfriends.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. He spent his first night sleeping on the actual streets when he was just 14.
14 years old. Think about that.
Which is also the age he started self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. But the detail that really, just stopped me in my tracks was about his younger sister, Megan.
Oh, that part is just devastating.
It is. Mad Dog literally begged his mother to put Megan into foster care to protect her from the abuse in their home. And the mother refused.
Because of the money, right?
Exactly. She refused specifically because she didn't want to lose the state benefit checks she received for having dependents.
See, that is a critical structural failure. The very system designed as a financial safety net for vulnerable children became the perverse incentive to keep those children trapped in a dangerous environment.
Yeah, trapped is the right word. He endured physical and sexual abuse from the men in his mother's life.
And he only survived by growing large enough to physically fight back. He played middle linebacker in high school, delivering these ferocious, angry hits.
Which is how he earned the nickname Mad Dog.
Exactly, but the psychological damage was already calcified by that point.
He avoided the juvenile justice system primarily by constantly running away, right?
Yeah, just staying on the move. And his sister Megan also fled. She ended up on the streets of Seattle and tragically died in a morgue at the age of 18.
Wow. You look at that childhood, and there's absolutely no foundation of safety. There's no baseline of trust in any adult, let alone any institution.
It's just wave after wave of betrayal for him.
So how does that shape him as an adult on the street?
Well, that lack of trust becomes his primary survival mechanism. He hits the road with two friends. They actually call themselves the Three Amigos.
They got matching tattoos, right?
Yeah, matching tattoos and everything. They bounce across California, Nevada, Texas, taking odd jobs. But the environment they inhabit is hyper-violent.
Right.
They get robbed at knife point, the group fractures, and Mad Dog ends up completely alone in Austin, where his substance abuse just drastically accelerates.
And then there's that near-fatal altercation with a drug dealer.
Yeah, after that, he just gets on a bus to anywhere. He manages to drop the hard narcotics, but he replaces them with a really severe alcohol dependency.
It's like this geographical churn. He goes from Austin to Santa Fe, gets pushed out of Santa Fe by city crackdowns on homeless encampments, and then moves up to Denver.
Which the book describes as a fatal funnel for narcotics and sex trafficking.
Yeah, a fatal funnel. After enduring even more violence there and collecting a new scar on his arm, he hikes 70 miles south to Colorado Springs.
And it sounds like Mad Dog is just moving from camp to camp to avoid the city's camping bans.
Exactly. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? You're moving, but you're still sinking. It's a game of municipal whack-a-mole.
That's a great way to put it. The city brings the legislative hammer down on a camp in a park, and the population just pops up under a highway overpass 2 miles away.
Or in the next town over. The pressure doesn't disappear. The human beings just relocate. Why wouldn't someone in his position immediately jump at the chance for free shelter?
Well, to understand why people like Mad Dog stay on the streets, you have to look at the psychological armor that this constant relocation forces a person to build.
Right, because the streets operate on a strictly transactional zero-sum economy.
Yeah, exactly. There is no unconditional support out there. If someone offers you a blanket or a sandwich, your immediate assumption is that they want something in return.
Or they're setting you up to be robbed.
Yes. You combine that deeply ingrained transactional mindset with the profound childhood trauma, the grief of losing his sister, and a severe chemical dependency.
And you're looking at a massive, seemingly impenetrable wall of distrust against the rest of society.
Precisely. So the hardest part isn't finding a bed for someone like Mad Dog.
It's getting him to voluntarily walk through the front gates of an institution and actually surrender his autonomy.
Yeah. How does someone with that level of entrenched paranoia end up at a rescue mission?
Well, the book says it's rarely a philosophical awakening. It is almost always driven by immediate biological necessity.
Like the weather.
Exactly. For Mad Dog, it's simply the weather. It's been raining every afternoon for a week in July. He's craving a drink, he's physically exhausted, and he just needs to get out of a severe thunderstorm.
He just wants to survive the night.
Right. So he walks down to the Springs rescue mission, hoping to secure a free meal and a dry spot to wait out the rain.
Interestingly, his friend Skeeter, who struggles with a severe meth addiction, actually refuses to go.
Yeah, Skeeter stays behind to watch their camp.
So walk us through the mechanics of that first encounter. Because the physical environment Mad Dog steps into seems really carefully engineered.
It is. He walks through the welcome center. He has to empty his pockets, go through a metal detector, so there is a high security posture immediately.
Which would normally trigger his paranoia, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. He gets an ID card and a map of the campus, but right past that security checkpoint, he sees a 46-unit pet kennel.
Ah, the pet kennel? That is huge.
Yeah. He immediately thinks of his friend Skeeter, who has a Yorkie named Prince, and refuses to go anywhere the dog isn't allowed.
That pet kennel is honestly one of the most brilliant architectural and psychological decisions on the entire campus.
Why is that? I mean, it's just dogs, right?
Because for many individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, a pet is literally their only consistent companion. It's their only source of unconditional love.
And it provides physical security, right? While sleeping outside.
Exactly. Traditional shelters almost universally prohibit pets due to sanitation and liability concerns.
Which makes sense on paper.
Right, on paper. But by investing in a state-of-the-art kennel, SRM completely eliminates a massive, agonizing barrier. People no longer have to choose between seeking warmth and abandoning the only creature that loves them.
It's removing a major point of friction. So Mad Dog goes into the dining hall, which seats 180 people, and he gets a hot meal.
And we're talking enchilada casserole, rice, and beans. Real food, not just a stale sandwich.
Yeah, but internally, his threat detection system is still firing on all cylinders. He's looking at the friendly staff and their lanyards, and his internal monologue is basically screaming, "What is the catch?"
Because there's always a catch on the street.
Always. He assumes this care for broken bodies is just bait for a trap.
Right.
He thinks they want to force him into a religious service or, harvest his soul.
And that suspicion is completely logical based on his lived experience. Historically, a lot of rescue missions operated on an exchange model.
Right, like you listen to our hour-long sermon, and in return, we will give you a bowl of soup.
Yes, and Mad Dog is bracing for that exact transaction. But SRM deliberately subverts that expectation.
This part is so cool. As Mad Dog is leaving to avoid the rain, he literally bumps into Jack Briggs, the CEO of the mission.
This is such a pivotal interaction. Jack doesn't offer a sermon. He doesn't ask if Mad Dog is sober.
What does he do?
He just extends his hand and says, "I'm Jack. What's your name?"
It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it?
It does, but Jack explains in the text that society systematically strips the unhoused of their names. People avert their eyes. They refer to them as the homeless or a nuisance or just a statistic.
Right.
Asking for a name and waiting for the answer establishes a crucial microtransaction of dignity.
Wow. And Jack offers him a dry bed for the night and explicitly promises there will be no sermons or mandatory altar calls.
And Mad Dog accepts the bed, but he refuses to give his real name. He introduces himself only by his street moniker, Mad Dog.
And Jack doesn't force the issue. He lets him in under the pseudonym. It's a very first chip in that wall of distrust.
It really is.
But to understand why it requires so much delicate psychological maneuvering to reach someone like Mad Dog, and why the streets are full of people just like him, we really need to zoom out a bit.
Yeah, we have to look at the broader context.
Because the book argues quite forcefully that national policies and traditional municipal shelter systems have fundamentally failed this demographic.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the definitions driving the funding.
The 4 categories of homelessness, right?
Exactly. The book outlines 4 distinct categories. First, there is transitional homelessness. That usually lasts less than a year due to a sudden catastrophic event like a job loss or a house fire.
Okay.
Then there is episodic homelessness, where someone cycles in and out of being unhoused at least 3 times in a given year.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Third is hidden homelessness, which includes people couch surfing or living in motels. And finally, there is chronic homelessness.
That's Mad Dog.
Yes, that is Mad Dog. A chronically homeless individual is an unaccompanied person with a disabling condition, which includes severe mental illness or substance use disorder, who has been unhoused continuously for over a year.
Got it. Now, for well over a decade, the dominant federal philosophy for addressing chronic homelessness has been a model known as housing first.
Often paired with permanent supportive housing, or PSH.
Right. The core premise here is treating housing as a fundamental human right, provided without preconditions.
Meaning you don't require the person to be sober, and you don't mandate mental health treatment prior to giving them the keys to an apartment.
The logic makes sense on the surface. You cannot reasonably expect a human being to conquer a severe methamphetamine addiction or stabilize schizophrenia while they were sleeping in a wet sleeping bag under a bridge.
The premise actually has a really strong clinical origin. It was heavily championed in the 1990s by a New York City psychiatrist named Dr. Sam Siebers.
What was his observation?
He observed that his efforts to treat his patients' psychiatric conditions were constantly derailed because they were returning to the chaos of the streets every single night.
So he hypothesized that stable housing had to come first.
Exactly. Establish stable housing as the foundation first, and the individual will have the necessary security to actually engage in health and behavioral treatments.
And for certain demographics, it demonstrated real success, didn't it?
It did. However, the authors of the book point out that over time, Housing First morphed from one available tool into an exclusive, federally mandated, one-size-fits-all approach.
Now, for you listening, we need to be very clear about our role here. The authors of Meeting Homelessness with Hope offer a fierce critique of this exclusive reliance on the Housing First model.
Right, and we are going to impartially report on their argument.
Because understanding their specific objections is the only way to understand why Colorado Springs went and built an entirely different architecture.
So what is the mechanical failure of Housing First, according to the book? The authors argue that while Housing First stems from a place of deep compassion, mandating it as the sole solution blatantly ignores the biological and psychological realities of severe addiction and untreated mental illness.
How so?
The book cites data arguing that simply placing an individual with a severe, untreated opioid dependency into an isolated apartment does not magically cure the dependency.
I mean, that makes sense. The addiction doesn't just evaporate.
Exactly. In fact, without mandatory check-ins or a supportive community structure, an isolated apartment can become a tomb.
That's a heavy word, a tomb.
It's what the authors argue. It separates them from the street-level interventions that might have reached them, allowing the destructive behavior to continue unchecked behind a locked door.
And they use a deeply provocative phrase to describe the mindset behind these policies. They call it toxic empathy.
That is a heavy accusation.
It is. What are the actual mechanics of toxic empathy?
As defined in the text, toxic empathy occurs when well-meaning individuals or policies provide relief in a manner that ultimately enables and prolongs destructive behavior, specifically by demanding zero accountability.
So, like allowing massive unsanitary congregated encampments on city sidewalks simply because it feels, quote-unquote, mean to ask people to move.
Yes, or handing over apartment keys with absolutely no requirement to engage in life-saving treatment. The authors argued this affirms a devastating power differential.
It's essentially saying, you are so fundamentally broken that we don't expect you to ever recover, so we're just going to warehouse you to keep you out of sight.
That is the core critique. It treats the individual not as a human capable of profound transformation, but as a permanent ward of the state. It traps them in their addiction rather than offering a structural pathway out of the suffering.
And the authors take this a step further, describing what they call the homeless industrial complex.
Which is a very loaded term.
It implies that there's a massive economic infrastructure. Nonprofits, affordable housing developers, city bureaucratic departments, grant writers, whose ongoing funding and salaries rely entirely on managing the crisis rather than actually solving it.
The book quotes a researcher who suggests this complex treats street populations almost like an endangered species to be protected in their natural habitat.
Wow.
It raises a very uncomfortable economic question. What happens to the billions of dollars in annual federal and state funding and the thousands of executive director salaries if the root causes of homelessness are actually addressed and the numbers plummet?
Do all those organizations willingly put themselves out of business?
The authors are pointing out that a system built exclusively on managing a crisis is financially incentivized to ensure that crisis never truly ends.
But the authors do point to a moment where the federal bureaucracy seemingly recognized this friction. They heavily reference a 2020 report from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD.
Titled Expanding the Toolbox. That report is central to their argument that alternatives exist.
What did the report say?
It was a candid, formal acknowledgement by HUD that an exclusive reliance on the Housing First doctrine was failing to stem the tide of rising chronic homelessness in major cities.
So they wanted to change course.
Yes, the report advocated for immediate flexibility. It called for funding a much broader coalition of methodologies, including faith-based agencies, high accountability programs, transitional congregate housing, and linear models where sobriety and vocational training are integrated into the housing process itself.
It was essentially a call for empirical pragmatism. Like, let's use every tool available, rigorously measure the outcomes, and fund whatever actually works for specific localized populations.
Exactly. Now, the book does note that this 2020 plan was quickly shelved by the subsequent administration following the election, and federal grant scoring reverted heavily back to prioritizing housing first.
Again, we are not here to endorse a political party's platform, but that shift perfectly illustrates the intense partisan tug-of-war over how billions of dollars in social safety net funding are deployed.
This raises an important question. If housing first isn't the silver bullet, what does a functioning alternative actually look like?
And to find that out, we have to leave the abstract debates of Washington, D.C. and look at the concrete reality of Colorado Springs. The statistics the book provides are genuinely startling.
Let's look at the baseline.
Okay, so El Paso County, where Colorado Springs is situated, has a population of roughly 760,000 people. Their 2023 point-in-time count, which is the federally mandated physical count of homeless individuals on a single night, identified 3,302 homeless people.
And the book contrasts this with the Multnomah County and Portland metro area.
Right. Portland has a similar overall population, but struggles with roughly 10 times the number of unsheltered individuals.
10 times. That is a staggering disparity when you have two geographic regions of comparable size, and one manages to keep its unsheltered population significantly contained while the rest of the country is experiencing alarming spikes. You have to dissect their ecosystem.
How did Colorado Springs engineer this outcome? What I found fascinating is that this massive civic victory didn't originate in a mayor's office or a city planning department or a corporate boardroom.
No, it started in a residential basement.
A basement.
The genesis of the Springs Rescue Mission is incredibly humble. It was not a top-down, taxpayer-funded initiative. It began in 1994 with a couple named Marilyn and Paul Vazorek.
Who were they?
They were recovering alcoholics who had found their own hard-fought sobriety and faith, and they simply felt compelled to help others struggling with the exact same demons.
So they just started doing the work.
Yeah, they started making peanut butter sandwiches and handing out warm clothes in local city parks. Eventually, they set up 4 cots in their own basement to offer a safe place to sleep for those who had nowhere else to go.
From 4 cots in a basement to a 14-acre, multi-million-dollar campus, I mean, that doesn't just happen by accident.
It requires a rare combination of visionary leadership and operational execution. The book frames this organizational evolution through the leadership styles of 2 key figures.
Right, Larry Yonker and Jack Briggs.
Yes. Let's start with Larry Yonker, whom the text explicitly compares to the biblical figure of Moses.
Because he was the visionary.
Exactly. Yonker was the relentless visionary. He looked at a series of rundown, disconnected buildings and empty dirt lots and saw the quote-unquote promised land of a comprehensive, integrated campus.
He really willed it into existence.
He guided the mission through its early, lean years, constantly fundraising, casting the vision, and operating on incredibly tight margins.
But visionary leadership eventually hits a ceiling when things scale to a certain complexity. That's where Jack Briggs enters the picture.
Right. Jack Briggs is described as the Joshua to Yonker's Moses. He is a retired 2-star Air Force general.
So he brings a very different energy.
An entirely different skill set. High-level operational strategy, complex logistics, and institutional discipline.
He takes the sprawling vision that Yonker fought for and institutionalizes the standard operating procedures.
Yes, and engineers the massive network of civic and private partnerships required to sustain a campus of that magnitude.
Building a massive, multi-million-dollar campus is a triumph of logistics, for sure. But getting the actual funding to pour concrete requires intense political maneuvering.
It always comes down to funding.
The real turning point for SRM, the moment that accelerated their timeline by decades, happened around 2014. And it stemmed directly from a major bureaucratic failure by the city government.
This is a textbook study in civic synergy and seizing an opportunity. At the time, former Mayor Steve Back had championed a grand vision to build a massive city-run campus called Sunrise Village.
The goal was to centralize all homeless services under municipal control, right?
Exactly. But the city government completely failed to execute. They faced ferocious, not in my backyard, pushback from neighborhood coalitions. They encountered massive zoning and environmental hurdles, and the project just bogged down in bureaucratic gridlock.
So Sunrise Village died on the vine.
It did. However, the city was holding a $3 million community development block grant, a CDBG from HUD that was strictly earmarked for homeless infrastructure.
And if the city didn't deploy those funds quickly, the federal government would claw them back.
Right. Enter Larry Yonker and the Springs Rescue Mission.
Because SRM already had the blueprints, they had engaged architects, they owned the adjacent land, and they were preparing to launch a massive $13.8 million capital campaign to expand their footprint.
But they were struggling to find the massive initial cash injection needed to break ground.
So when the city's Sunrise Village project collapsed, the city council made a highly controversial and bold decision. They redirected that entire $3 million federal grant directly to Springs Rescue Mission.
Which is a massive political risk. Funneling millions of taxpayer dollars into a vocal, faith-based organization is a move that usually invites lawsuits and intense public scrutiny.
It was a tremendous risk, but that initial $3 million acted as the critical catalyst. It provided the project with undeniable municipal legitimacy.
Once the city put its weight behind SRM, major private philanthropic heavyweights like the Daniels Fund, the Anschutz Foundation, and the El Pomar Foundation stepped up with massive million-dollar matching grants.
And a coalition of local churches, known as Cos I Love You, mobilized and raised another $1.2 million from private citizens.
The authors explicitly note that this specific maneuver by the city council accelerated the physical building of the campus by 25 years.
25 years. That's incredible. And here is where the legal mechanics of municipal policy become deeply intertwined with SRM's expansion.
Let's talk about the camping bans.
Right. Colorado Springs, like countless cities across the nation, wanted to pass and enforce no-sit, no-lie ordinances. These are camping bans that make it illegal to pitch a tent or sleep on public sidewalks, in city parks, or along waterways.
And local business owners and neighborhood associations fiercely argued these bans were necessary to maintain public safety, sanitation, and the economic viability of the downtown corridor.
But the city couldn't legally enforce those bans. Based on precedents set by ACLU lawsuits and other jurisdictions, federal courts have effectively ruled that a municipality cannot criminalize the act of sleeping outside if there are not sufficient shelter beds available for those individuals.
Right, you cannot legally ban a human being from sleeping on the grass if there is literally nowhere else in the city for them to exist.
This legal bottleneck is where SRM's expansion fundamentally alters the city's power dynamics. By executing that final $18 million total capital campaign, SRM expanded their physical capacity to 450 beds.
And suddenly, the city possessed the required shelter capacity.
Exactly. This provided the legal, and many would argue the ethical foundation for the police department's Homeless Outreach Team, or HOT, to actively enforce the camping bans.
But crucially, instead of just arresting people and throwing them in county jail, the HOT teams now had a designated, highly resourced campus to transport them to.
They could look a person in the eye and say, you cannot legally sleep in this park, but we can drive you to Springs Rescue Mission right now where there's a warm bed waiting for you.
And again, we're staying completely impartial on the intense moral and political controversy surrounding the implementation of camping bans.
We are simply explaining the mechanics as presented in this source text. The municipal government became entirely reliant on a private, faith-based mission to provide the infrastructure that made their citywide policies legally enforceable.
And that profound reliance highlights why the physical layout and the underlying philosophy of the SRM campus are so vital. It couldn't just be a sterile warehouse filled with 450 cots.
If the police drop people off, the environment has to be designed in a way that highly traumatized individuals like Mad Dog will voluntarily tolerate and eventually choose to stay in.
Which brings us to the actual architecture of this 14-acre space. Because having the beds is just a math equation. Creating an environment that neutralizes paranoia is an entirely different discipline.
So how did they design it?
To understand the spatial design, we have to explore Larry Yonker's driving metaphor for the entire community of Hope Campus. He conceptualized the physical and programmatic space as the lake and the river.
The lake and the river, I like that.
The lake is the physical campus itself. It is explicitly designed to be a safe, peaceful, highly welcoming gathering place where individuals can find rest without the constant threat of street harassment or police sweeps.
Operationally, it functions as a low-barrier shelter.
Right. We contrasted this earlier with high accountability programs, so let's get into the mechanics of what low barrier actually means on a Tuesday night at 10 p.m.
Okay, what does it mean?
Low barrier means the threshold for entry is kept intentionally close to the ground. Individuals can enter the campus and utilize the day centers, the laundry facilities, and the dining hall, even if they are currently intoxicated or have drugs in their system.
Wow.
They can enter if they have a lengthy criminal record. They are not required to present a government ID to receive a hot meal.
What are the rules then?
The only absolute non-negotiable requirement is that they adhere to behavioral safety protocols. If they become violent, start a fight, or threaten the safety of guests or staff, they are immediately escorted off the premises.
Though they're typically allowed to return the next day once they have stabilized, right?
Exactly. And as we discussed with Mad Dog, this is where the pet kennels play a massive role in maintaining the calm waters of that lake.
Removing that point of friction allows people to exhale. They don't have to stay vigilant to protect their dog from being stolen, so their nervous system can finally begin to downregulate.
But I know what you're thinking.
Yeah, I have to push back here, because this sounds like a potential recipe for disaster. Doesn't building a highly comfortable lake with free meals, free laundry, day centers with televisions, and state-of-the-art pet care, doesn't that just incentivize people to stay homeless forever?
That is the big concern.
Right. If all of their basic survival needs are provided for free, without any demand for sobriety or job searching, how do you prevent this beautiful campus from devolving into a massive, permanent city-sanctioned campsite?
That is the exact critique leveled by proponents of stricter, high-accountability linear models. They argue you are just enabling the lifestyle.
And do they have a point?
Well, that is exactly where the river becomes the engine of the entire operation. The book states quite clearly that a lake without an outlet becomes a stagnant Dead Sea.
Wow.
The river represents the tiered programming, designed to create a subtle but undeniable current that pulls people out of the comfort of the lake and back into functioning society.
But you can't mandate willpower, so how do they generate that current without forcing people out the door?
They generate the current through a structure they call the 3 Rs: relief, restoration, and reintegration.
Break those down for us.
The relief phase encompasses the basic survival elements of the lake: the food, the floor mats in the emergency shelter, the showers. That level of care is free, unconditional, and indefinite.
Okay, so that's the baseline.
However, if a guest desires more comfort, better sleeping accommodations, or greater privileges on campus, they must voluntarily step into the restoration current.
What does that involve?
They have to start meeting with caseworkers, attending addiction recovery meetings, or engaging with psychiatric professionals.
And then the third R?
That restoration current eventually flows into reintegration, which involves rigorous vocational training and moving into transitional housing.
So, mechanically, you can sleep on a thin mat in the crowded relief shelter for free for the rest of your life. But if you want to upgrade to a semi-private room with a real mattress or get access to the culinary training program, you have to play by the rules of the river.
You never force them out of the lake, but you make the current of the river incredibly appealing. You incentivize forward movement through incremental rewards.
That conceptual framework is elegant, but translating a metaphor into reality for a guy who has been self-medicating with alcohol for 20 years is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
How does that current actually work to pull someone like Mad Dog out of the deep end of the lake?
To operationalize the river, SRM utilizes a specific set of metrics and psychological ingredients defined by Joel Siebersma, the Senior Director of Transformation and Research.
Right. He distills their ultimate destinations into a formula. H2 plus W.
H2 plus W: housing, health, and work. Those are the final destinations. But to propel a guest toward those goals, Siebersma argues the staff must cultivate 3 specific operational ingredients: agency, activity, and consistency.
Agency is a fascinating word choice. How does SRM manufacture agency in someone who feels completely powerless?
Agency is the internal spark. It's the intrinsic want to. You cannot force an addict to change. You can only inspire the desire for a different life.
How do they do that?
SRM staff are meticulously trained to constantly pepper guests with what-if questions. What if you didn't have to sleep in a room with 50 other guys tonight? What if you were sober for just 1 week? What if you had a job where people respected you?
It is a deliberate strategy to give traumatized individuals permission to dream again, to help them realize they still possess the power of choice.
Exactly. And once that spark of agency is lit, you have to capture that momentum immediately, which leads to activity.
Activity is the physical doing. It's the daily, unglamorous grind.
Right. Siebersma, who is an ultramarathon runner, uses a brilliant analogy here. He notes that running 100 miles through the mountains is incredibly difficult, but it is not intellectually complex.
You simply put one foot in front of the other.
The key to finishing is that you never focus on the 100-mile finish line. You only focus on running to the very next aid station.
Activity at SRM is about setting tiny, ridiculously manageable goals. You don't tell a guest to go get a career and sign a lease today. You tell them to focus on taking a shower or showing up to a 10-minute meeting on time.
And then consistency is the discipline of stringing those aid stations together over months and years to build long-term neurological and behavioral stability.
Consistency is what ultimately rewires the brain, turning forced activity into a permanent new lifestyle. Let's track Mad Dog's specific evolution through these mechanics.
Okay, let's look at his journey.
He's been hanging around the lake for a while. He's utilizing the relief shelter, getting his free enchilada casseroles, but he's still drinking heavily. However, he starts seeing other guys he knows from the street walking around the campus looking healthier, wearing clean work clothes.
And that observation sparks his agency. He decides he wants to try.
So he attends a brief orientation meeting for the HOPE program, and this is where the ingredient of activity is brilliantly applied. They do not sit him down and hand him a daunting 50-page behavioral contract.
They hand him a single piece of paper called a passport to hope.
The psychology of this is brilliant. The passport to hope acts like a campus orientation scavenger hunt, but instead of finding the library, you're finding your own agency.
It takes a massive, overwhelming life overhaul and breaks it down into tiny, actionable signatures.
To gain entry into the program, Mad Dog simply has to navigate the campus and collect 5 signatures.
Just 5 signatures. He has to meet with the campus chaplain, not to endure a sermon, but simply to share his story so the chaplain can pray for him.
He has to meet with a representative from the Department of Human Services to verify his legal identity and check on potential benefits.
He has to sit down with physical health professionals at Peak Vista Medical, engage with behavioral health counselors at Diversus Health, and finally meet with the vocational training staff.
It is the gamification of initial engagement. For a man whose brain is wired to view every institution as a threat, saying, just go get these 5 signatures on this piece of paper, feels like an achievable game. It is a highly accessible aid station.
And the gamification bypasses his defense mechanisms. He gets the signatures. He enters the program. As he strings those aid stations together, he builds the consistency required to commit to the hardest current in the river.
The New Life Program, or NLP.
This is a grueling 1-year residential addiction recovery program located directly on campus. He endures the physical agony of alcohol withdrawals. He participates in intensive group therapy confronting his childhood trauma, and he takes emotional regulation and anger management classes.
He also enters the vocational training current by joining Samaritan's Kitchen.
Samaritan's Kitchen is a powerhouse. They serve over 200,000 meals a year to the campus population, and the trainees in the culinary arts program prepare almost all of them.
Mad Dog learns professional knife skills, bulk menu preparation, and earns his Serve Safe certification. He actually starts working catering events off campus.
And the most beautiful, symbolic moment of this entire journey is when he graduates the NLP. As he reclaims his sobriety and his dignity, he reclaims his identity.
He formally drops an aggressive street moniker, Mad Dog, and asks the staff and his peers to call him by his given name, Joe.
It is a profound trajectory. We followed a man who walked out of the rain assuming a bowl of soup was a malicious trap and watched him transform into Joe, a certified culinary professional living in stable transitional housing.
But stepping back from Joe's triumphant personal story, there is a glaring logistical reality we have to address. SRM is a faith-based rescue mission. They are not a licensed hospital, they are not a psychiatric facility, and they are not the Department of Motor Vehicles.
No, they are not.
They could not possibly provide all the specialized legal, medical, and psychiatric services required to fulfill those Passport to Hope signatures on their own.
They absolutely cannot. Attempting to do so would bankrupt them and dilute their core mission. Recognizing that limitation led to the most critical structural component of their success.
Which is?
Engineering a massive, deeply integrated network of civic partnerships.
Let's look at the sheer scale of this. The book describes the Community of Hope not just as a shelter, but as a multi-agency hub. There are over 50 distinct partner agencies operating directly on the SRM campus.
50 agencies. Consider the logistical friction that eliminates. For an unhoused individual who has severe anxiety, no reliable transportation, and painful foot issues, traversing an entire city via a fragmented bus system to visit 5 different government buildings just to secure a replacement ID, apply for food stamps, see a doctor, and talk to a counselor is an insurmountable barrier.
They will simply give up.
Yes. By inviting the Department of Human Services, Peak Vista Medical, Veterans Services, and legal aid clinics to open offices directly on the campus, the life-saving services are positioned right there on the shores of the lake.
But the logistics of hosting 50 distinct entities on one campus must be a nightmare. You have federal bureaucrats, state health workers navigating HIPAA compliance, secular nonprofits, and corporate healthcare providers, all operating within the footprint of a very vocal evangelical Christian rescue mission.
The friction is immense.
There has to be profound ideological and cultural friction there. You have secular social workers who might be deeply skeptical of faith-based interventions working alongside chaplains.
This is where CEO Jack Briggs' specific bridge-building philosophy is the glue holding the entire ecosystem together. He uses a very practical analogy of building a bridge across a wide river.
How does he frame it?
If you only build from your side and demand that everyone else adopt your exact blueprints, your specific theology, or your political worldview, the bridge never gets built.
You just end up standing on your respective riverbanks, yelling at each other about who is right.
Exactly. Briggs argues you have to build from opposite sides toward a common central goal. You do not have to agree on theology or municipal zoning or even the ultimate philosophical cause of homelessness.
So what's the common ground?
When secular organizations hesitate or push back on partnering with a Christian mission, Briggs stops the debate and asks one foundational question. Do you believe people have worth?
That is the anchor point.
When the secular agency answers, yes, we believe people have inherent worth, Briggs says, us too, we agree on the most important thing, Let's work together based on that shared truth.
That's powerful.
He doesn't demand they adopt his faith. They don't demand SRM stop being a mission. They simply build the bridge toward that shared belief in human dignity.
And the economic impact of that specific type of collaborative bridge building is profound. The book cites a Baylor University study regarding the financial efficacy of faith-based organizations operating in this sector.
The data from that Baylor study is staggering. It found that faith-based organizations are consistently at the forefront of addressing the root causes of chronic homelessness, actually providing the vast majority of emergency shelter beds nationally.
But economically, the study estimates that faith-based organizations generate $9.72 in taxpayer savings for every single $1 invested by the government.
$9.42 for every dollar. That is an unbelievable return on investment. And you see that collaborative, multi-agency investment manifest physically right next door to SRM in a project called Greenway Flats.
Greenway Flats is the ultimate physical embodiment of this unlikely partnership model. It is a 65-unit permanent supportive housing, or PSH, apartment building.
Wait, let's pause here. Earlier, we detailed the author's fierce critique of Housing First and PSH as a standalone national policy. They called it toxic empathy.
Right. Yet here they are, actively participating in a PSH project.
This is where the nuance of their argument is critical. They critique PSH when it operates as a disconnected, isolated mandate that offers a room but zero accountability or community support.
How is Greenway Flats different?
Greenway Flats operates on a completely different paradigm. It was constructed by a private, for-profit developer, Norwood Development, led by Chris Jenkins, who deliberately partnered with SRM. It was partially funded by city and state affordable housing grants.
But crucially, the building is physically adjacent to the mission and is actively serviced by SRM caseworkers.
So it's not just an isolated apartment block where people with severe trauma are given a key and left entirely to their own devices.
It proves that the Housing First housing model and the faith-based high accountability treatment model do not have to be mortal enemies. They can be synthesized.
The municipal government provided the necessary capital, the private developer provided the construction efficiency, and the faith-based mission provides the daily human connection, the casework, and the community integration.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
this is what happens when a city stops engaging in what the book calls the nonprofit Hunger Games.
The nonprofit Hunger Games. That is the tragic reality in many cities.
Where charities fiercely compete against each other for scraps of government funding, tearing each other down in grant applications. When a city unites behind a shared infrastructure and organizations stop fighting over who gets the credit, you can actually build an ecosystem that permanently changes the landscape.
It is the definitive difference between a fragmented, competitive ecosystem that merely manages pain and a unified, collaborative ecosystem that actually engineers recovery.
We have covered massive ground here. We've looked at systemic institutional failures, the national policy debates over Housing First, the basement origins of SRM, the architectural mechanics of the lake and the river, and these sprawling civic partnerships.
We really have.
But I want to pivot and bring the focus directly down to the ground level. I want to talk directly to you, the listener, because the author spent a significant portion of the text answering the so what. What does this vast infrastructure mean for your personal engagement?
Let's pose the scenario the book outlines.
What exactly should you do when you are stopped at a traffic light and you see a person flying a cardboard sign on the street corner?
It is the most common, visceral interaction the average citizen has with homelessness, and it is almost always fraught with internal conflict, guilt, and confusion.
Jack Briggs offers incredibly stark, direct advice on this interaction. Stop handing money or food out your car window.
It's a tough pill to swallow because our initial instinct when we see a cardboard sign is genuine compassion. We want to help. We think that $5 bill is a lifeline.
But Jack Briggs flips that entirely on its head.
He validates the compassion, but he argues that the action itself is often fueled by that toxic empathy we discussed earlier. Briggs suggests that transactional giving, handing over a $5 bill or a bottle of water at a stoplight, is largely a mechanism to alleviate our own personal discomfort.
We want to feel better as we drive away.
Exactly. But that microtransaction does not substantively help the individual. In fact, it affirms a damaging power differential. I am the resource provider, you are the dependent, but we are not equals.
More dangerously, it financially enables that person to remain in the highly lethal environment of the street corner.
By giving him $5, you are funding the ecosystem of the street corner, rather than funding the ecosystem of recovery.
Briggs advises that instead of rolling down your window and offering cash, you should engage them verbally. Point them toward the rescue mission where true, multi-agency wraparound services exist. Tell them exactly where they can get a hot meal, a safe bed, and medical care.
And then take the money you would have handed out the window and donate it directly to the organization that is doing the heavy systemic lifting of restoration.
Which brings up a fascinating point about how SRM views itself as a recipient of those donations. The book uses a powerful biblical metaphor to describe their operational philosophy, the 10-talent organization.
The parable of the talents is fundamentally about the ethics of stewardship. A master gives his servants different amounts of money talents.
The servant, given 10 talents, actively invests the money, takes calculated risks, and doubles the investment.
The servant given 1 talent is paralyzed by fear, hides the money in the ground, and yields 0 return. SRM views itself not as a charity that just spends money, but as a steward ethically obligated to multiply its resources. They are fundamentally dissatisfied with merely maintaining the status quo.
They are actively trying to be the 10-talent servant.
They believe they have an obligation to constantly adapt, to rigorously gather data, and to pivot their operations when the data changes.
For example, the book details what happened when SRM finally managed to fully enclose their 14-acre campus and establish strict security protocols.
Right. Once the campus was genuinely safe, they noticed the female demographic utilizing the services jumped dramatically from 15% to over 30%.
Women are often the invisible homeless, hiding in the shadows, because the visible street camps are exceptionally dangerous for them. When the campus became a true sanctuary, they arrived in droves.
And a 10-talent organization doesn't just look at that data and say, oh, look, more women, let's buy more cots. They fundamentally adapt their programming.
They immediately mobilize their resources and create a brand new specialized women's addiction recovery program. They replicated the successful architecture of the men's model, but tailored the clinical approach to address the specific types of trauma and physiological needs of the female population.
That is what responsible stewardship of resources looks like in action.
And they actively invite the community to participate in that stewardship through what they call their Good Samaritan Sponsor Program. The mathematical goal of this program is incredibly specific. They want to get exactly 2.5% of the population of Colorado Springs to commit to giving just $25 a month.
It's a highly strategic approach to philanthropy, especially effective for engaging younger demographics, millennials and Gen Z, who might not have the capacity for massive million-dollar grants, but who desperately want to see a direct, localized impact.
$25 a month covers the exact cost of a warm bed and 3 healthy meals for one person for a single night.
If just 2.5% of the city participates, it fully funds the entire baseline operational costs of the mission, which frees up the massive philanthropic grants to be invested entirely in future innovations and expanded housing.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It challenges you to completely rethink your own philanthropic footprint, no matter how large or small your budget is.
The book poses a fantastic diagnostic question. Are you funding a sprinkler system?
Meaning, are you haphazardly giving $5 here, $10 there, handing cash out the car window, spreading your limited resources so thin that it just dampens the surface without ever reaching the root system of the problem?
Or are you investing in a lake? Are you finding an organization in your own community that is doing deep restorative work, one that aggressively partners with others, meticulously measures its outcomes, and fiercely affirms human dignity, and pooling your resources there to create real generational change?
It is a profound call to move away from passive, guilt-driven transactions and step into active, strategic, community-level engagement. Let's recap this journey. We started by examining the gridlock of national policy, the frustration with one-size-fits-all mandates that often warehouse people behind closed doors without addressing their underlying pain. We met Mad Dog, whose story illuminated the profound childhood trauma and the massive walls of distrust that define chronic homelessness.
Then we traveled to Colorado Springs to dissect a localized anomaly, a low-barrier, highly partnered campus that acts as a safe lake, intentionally feeding into a structured, aspirational river of recovery.
We saw how civic synergy, the willingness to build bridges across ideological divides, and an unwavering belief in human worth was starting with the CEO simply asking, "What's your name?" can actually move the needle on a crisis that feels utterly unsolvable to most of the country.
They view the unhoused not as a civic nuisance to be eradicated or managed, but as neighbors with inherent divine worth who require a sophisticated balance of both grace and accountability to find their way home.
It is a powerful, highly replicable blueprint. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
If we look beyond the specific crisis of the unhoused population, there is a much broader psychological application here. If this lake and river model balancing unconditional relief and physical safety with structured aspirational reintegration works so effectively to heal the profound, traumatized isolation of chronic homelessness, how might we apply this exact same architecture of grace and accountability to the growing epidemic of extreme loneliness and social isolation in our broader society?
What does a low-barrier shelter for social connection look like in your own neighborhood or in your own corporate workplace? How do we purposefully build environments that require absolutely nothing for entry, but gently, consistently invite people into deeper community?
That is a phenomenal question to chew on. How do we build lakes and rivers in our own daily lives?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into meeting homelessness with hope. We hope it challenges you to look past the symptoms, to seek out the root causes, and to keep asking those tough what-if questions in your own communities.
And remember, the next time you look at a complex social issue and expect a clean, binary, broken or not broken X-ray, you might just be looking at diagnostic muddy waters.
But as we've seen today, even the muddiest waters can be navigated if you're willing to build a bridge. Until next time.